I'd like first to thank Christine for inviting me to make this presentation. Actually, as a result of a publication of my colleague Hélène Maheu and myself in Canadian diversity issue called People of African Descent in Canada, a Diversity of Origins and Identities. I'd like to perhaps first talk about the challenges that confront Statistics Canada when it comes to defining ethnocultural diversity in the country, and talk about the concept, the evolution of concepts, and questions that are being asked in our census as well as major surveys. Earlier, our colleagues talked about the importance of discourse. Juliana, for instance, talked about the importance of language, as well as Christine. The way the words we use, the concepts we use, can have an important consequences on how we see the world. So if we just move to the next slide. The idea is really to show that the choices of concepts, methods, and tools used to measure and analyze the ethnocultural diversity of the Canadian population are not arbitrary, but depends on a combination of factors. For example, demographic changes, the influence of government policies and programs, legislative bodies, scientific developments and research, technological changes, public opinion. They all affect how diversity is measured, collected, and communicated. And so, in this context, Statistics Canada is in the middle of all these forces, and the agencies must constantly take these factors into account to keep its activities relevant and maintain its ability to respond to emerging issues. It should, by the same token, allow data users to follow the historical changes of diversity and the dynamics of inclusion or exclusion associated with them. To measure and take into account the evolution of ethnocultural diversity in Canada, as well as issues related to inclusion and exclusion, Stats Canada has a rich set of tools and data sources, but the census is certainly one of the most important ones. So next slide. What you can see on this slide is that the ethnocultural question asked in next slide, please. So the ethnocultural questions asked in the census of populations have changed greatly since the beginning of the Canadian Confederation. Between 1871 and 1901, very few questions, as you can see on the screen, were asked in the census, in particular because aside from Indigenous people, the population of Canada was essentially made of people of French and British origins. Research has shown that at the start of the 20th century, nation building, the arrival of many immigrants from Europe, integration issues, and other issues surrounding the definition of identity led to the addition of questions on language, immigration, citizenship, and parents' place of birth. In addition, and I think this is an important, element, following the tragedy of the Second World War, the notion of race was eliminated from census questions on origin. Discriminatory immigration selection criteria were scrapped, which led to significant diversification of immigration source countries by the 1970s. Within the context of its work during the 60s, the Dunton-Laurando Commission recommended adding a question in the census on the main language spoken by Canadians. So there are many examples of historical milestones that have influenced the question asked in the census, including the Canadian Multiculturalism Act, the Official Languages Act, the Employment Equity Act, from which emerged the notion of visible minorities, the acceptance of multiple answers on ethnic origin, citizenship, and languages starting in the 80s, and also the major changes in how Indigenous people are measured and enumerated in Canada. So let's move to the next slide. Now the question is, how do we define and measure Canada's population of African descent? There are so many different notions and concepts and ways to measure them using census and survey data. For the most part, the census has information on country of birth, whether of the person or their parents. We also have a question since since the beginning of the Confederation on ethnic or cultural origin. Way back when we used to talk about racial origin or race per se. As I just alluded to it, obviously this concept evolved considerably. But following the report Equality Now by Justice Rosalie Abella in 1986, Equality Now, the concept of visible minorities became officialized, and this was used more and more. But at the same time, created a lot of, or a lack of consensus, if I may say, because of the way it is used, because of, the way we talk about a population as, being distinguished between visible minorities and non-visible minorities. So basically, the group designated as visible minorities was, we don't see in the census per se the word visible minorities, but the question is there in the census to mention that in order to create equal opportunities for all Canadians, these data become necessary. But still, Statistics Canada right now is revisiting the use of visible minorities for analytical and dissemination purposes in order to better understand, the diversity within the population. So if we move to the next slide, as I just mentioned, given these different concepts, it is key that, it is key to understand that in the census, not everybody identify as being of African descent. How do we measure being, the population of African descent? For instance, when we look at all ethnic or cultural origin, in 2016, 1,067,000 or 68,000 Canadians, reported having African origins. At the same time, we have 1.2 million Canadians who identified as Black Canadians. If we focus directly on all Black Canadians reporting an African origin, well, it goes down to 592,000. So you can see that there are different ways of talking about this population, and it's still important to understand that, depending on whether you focus on people born in Africa or those born in Canada who simply identify as Canadians, not necessarily as, of African descent, person. Well, you see the challenge we have before us when it comes to disseminate information on this population. Let's move to the next slide, where you have a sense of the growth of the African-born immigrant population living in Canada. So in 1961 census, less than 5,000 people, because of the obviously immigration and discriminatory immigration policies, very few people immigrated from Africa. But in 2016, we had close to 637,000 people of, African-born immigrants, representing 8 or 9% of the immigrant population. We also need to keep in mind that during the 2016 census, it was the first time in history that the population from Africa surpassed the population. I'm talking about recent immigrants here coming from Europe. So it is a significant trend that we're observing right now, and because of the fact that this population is very young, clearly there is enormous diversity within that population, and this population is likely to grow significantly over the next decades. So the last slide I'd like to show to you is really about, looking at the information we have in the census, where we focus on this population group question where it's possible to identify the Black population, but where we look at the place of birth. And so you can really see clearly that even when we focus on, let's say on the left-hand side, the first column, those born in Africa, you can see that there are people who identify as Arab, those who identify as Black, as South Asian. So you can really see the enormous diversity. So when we talk about African descent, the language we use, the concepts we use, and the way people identify themselves can be a real challenge, but at least it shows the tremendous diversity that we have about the African descent population. In closing, I'd like to also mention that over the last 2 years, Statistics Canada has published 4 different reports on Canada's Black population about, the enormous diversity that we can find within that population in terms of language, in terms of origin, in terms of, age group, so on and so forth. But we also released a significant report that were really welcomed by, many associations, from the Black communities in Canada about the socioeconomic challenges faced by Canada's Black population, as well as the challenges faced by youth, Black youth, in their transition from, the school system to the labor market. So clearly, I think Statistics Canada really committed to make sure that it can provide more disaggregated data on Canada's Black population or population of African descent. And I think moving forward in 2021 census, a lot of disaggregated data by ethnic or cultural origin within the Black population, and all these different indicators will be available to the large public. Thank you very much for your attention.